introduce Dr. Peggy Clements, who is our moderator and also presenter this afternoon. And Peggy, good afternoon, and what a great webinar.
Thanks very much, Peter. I've been watching the polls as we've been getting started. It's really a pleasure to see that there are so many different folks joining us from across the country and a lot of people in the business of providing education, a lot of practitioners, state level, district level folks. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to your questions. As Peter was mentioning in the setup to our event, this bridge event, the title is Online Learning and Credit Recovery, What We Know from Research and Practice. The focus today is really going to be mostly on research. We hope to hear from some of you all in the audience about some of the issues you face regarding your practice. This webinar is being hosted by the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance at REL Northeast Islands. The Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance as a group with their researchers have been engaged in a set of research studies over the past several years, investigating and trying to understand better how rural schools and districts can support their students' academic success. And one of the areas in which they had a particular interest was understanding how technology could support student success. And so you're going to hear today about a study that we conducted with them to get some baseline information about that, as well as another research study. Welcome, and I'm giving you the introduction right now. As I said a second ago, I'll be presenting the results of a survey study that REL Northeast conducted in collaboration with the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance. We'll have a few minutes for questions after that, and then we'll have the second and longer featured presentation today will be from Dr. Kirk Walters, who's a principal researcher at American Institutes for Research. He's going to be presenting about a rigorous research study he conducted with colleagues at AIR and the Consortium for Chicago School Research, investigating the effectiveness of an online credit recovery study. After the two presentations, we're really lucky to have Dr. Fiona Hollins from the Center for Benefit Cost Studies of Education at Teachers College at Columbia University here to comment on the studies and raise some really, Fiona always has great questions, and so I anticipate that she'll be raising some great questions today. We will also have plenty of time at the end and throughout, really, for your questions and comments. So please, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat. Our colleagues are following along in the chat, and will be identifying the questions and presenting them to the presenters so that we can answer them throughout this session. Coming into these kinds of events, the RELs always want to make really clear to our participants what our goals are for you in this session today. And so our goals for this session today are that you'll leave this session understanding the prevalence, purposes, and reported challenges of online learning in the Greater Capital Region of New York. That's the REL Northeast Islands study that I'll be talking about. That you'll understand the findings of the online credit recovery study that Dr. Kirk Walters will be presenting, and that, excuse me, and that based on our discussions and conversations and along with the comments we'll have from Dr. Fiona Hollins, that you'll have the opportunity to discuss the implications of the use of online learning to expand credit recovery options to students who failed a course, and that together, through the chat and discussions, we might have the opportunity to consider and discuss the kinds of support that students might need if they were to take a credit recovery study. All right, so at this point, we'd like to get a little bit of information from you about your interest in this particular topic. We've got a poll that we're going to ask you to fill out. So we would really like to know what your motivation is for joining us today. So what's your current interest in online credit recovery? Are you a school or district that's currently using online courses for credit recovery and want to learn more about what the research has to say about that? Are you a school or district that's considering implementing online credit recovery in the future? Or are you just an interested party, someone who wants to know more about this topic? All right, so great. Lots of people interested in this topic. It's an important topic. All three of us today, the presenters, myself, Kirk Walters, and Fiona Hollins, we agree with you. We're interested in learning more about this topic. We're glad you're here to join with us about this, and we're glad to see that we have some practitioners who are using online learning. We'll be very interested in your questions and comments, as well as folks who are thinking about using online credit recovery in the future. All right, so I'm the first presenter. So today I'm going to be talking about a survey study that REL Northeast Islands conducted in collaboration with members of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance. This was a study, as I mentioned earlier, the members of NERDRA, of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance, the members came into the work really interested in learning more about how educational technology can support student success. And to this end, we began to look and see, well, what kind of data are available out there in the world to learn more about how schools are using online learning. And what we discovered was that New York, like essentially almost every state in the country, doesn't systematically collect data about what schools are offering online courses, what courses students are taking online, or how students do in those courses. And so given this lack of data, our Alliance members wanted some baseline information about how schools are using online courses for their students. So in particular, they wanted to understand why schools are turning to online courses and how they're using them for their students. So what kinds of courses are they offering students, and how what kinds of challenges they're encountering in that process. The most recent data that we have about the nation as a whole dates back to the 2009-2010 academic year, when the National Center for Education Statistics at the U.S. Department of Education conducted a nationally representative survey that asked districts about how they are using different types of technology-based distance education. At this point, I'd actually like to point down to a particular section of the Adobe Connect environment. If you look right below the slides, you'll see to download today's files. And so throughout the sessions, I'll be pointing out to you different resources that are available to you throughout the session. And this first study that I'm referring to, this National Center for Education Statistics survey study that was a nationwide study looking at how and why districts are using technology-based distance education, that's the first file that's listed there, Distance Education Courses Report. So going back to 2009, based on this NCES data that they had collected in 2009 and previously in the 2004-2005 school year, we knew that the use of online courses was growing really rapidly, and we knew that about 55% of districts were using some sort of technology-based distance education. Most of these districts were using online learning as a technology-based distance education option. And one of the most frequent uses of online courses for students was to provide credit recovery options. And so starting from that very important survey, the researchers worked with members of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance to develop a survey that we adapted from this NCES report that I just talked about, as well as drew from a survey that I conducted with my collaborators on this research, Erin Stafford, Angela Pizzalia, and also Jackie Zweig, a survey that we had developed for a research alliance that we're working with in the Midwest. So we worked with our alliance members to go through those survey questions to identify the research questions that were most important to them and the survey questions that we wanted to use for this survey. We then collaborated with a group in New York State called the Capital Area School Development Association, and they sent the survey to all of their member high schools. They have 99 member high schools, and of those 99 high schools, 59 schools responded. And of the schools that responded, over half of them reported having enrolled students in online courses during the 2012-2013 school year. And on average, these schools reported enrolling approximately 6% of their student population in an online course. Just one more time, I just want to point down to the document below, the section below, download today's files, and I just want to point out a few of the files that we have before I move into the findings. There's the Distance Education Courses Report, that's the NCES report, that's the top one. The study that I'm going to be talking about today, Online Course Use in New York, there's a brief version of that study report that's down and available for download, as well as a study that my colleagues and I conducted with REL Midwest, a similar study looking at online course use in Iowa and Wisconsin. Okay, so the interesting part of this presentation, so how are CASDA high schools using online courses for students? And these are the results. So as you can see from this graph, I mean, by a wide margin, the most common use of online courses in the CASDA high schools. So these are high schools around the capital area of Albany, New York. The most common use of online courses was for credit recovery. And so we were really interested by this because this also mirrors what the NCES study showed from 2009, 2010, and it was also similar to what we found with our colleagues in the Midwest. And so, you know, one of the reasons why I think today's session is really important, and we worked to bring Dr. Walters in to talk about his study and Dr. Hollins to talk about her work investigating online courses and thinking about the cost effectiveness of those courses, is that we know based on this survey and these other surveys that many, many schools and districts across the United States are using online learning for credit recovery. So this particular slide, I should actually clarify it just a little bit. What we asked our participants for this slide was we asked them what was the educational objectives of the online courses that students took. And they could respond, advanced placement, elective, core courses, or credit recovery courses. Now then, the response to the next question isn't going to be much of a surprise, because one of the other questions we asked them was what was their motivation, or how important were various reasons for using online courses for their students. Not surprisingly, given how many schools use credit recovery, use online learning for credit recovery, one of the most important motivators for using online courses was to provide students with credit recovery opportunities. And so 82% of the schools responded that offering credit recovery was a very important reason for having an online course. Of the top remaining reasons, so I'm not going to go through this whole list. If you'd like to look at the findings in more depth, please feel free to go and download the report that's below. But what I'd like to do is point out that of the other top 5 reasons, 2 of the reasons relate to students' educational experiences. So the idea of providing students with an alternative learning environment or providing students with the opportunity for personalized learning. But the other two other of the top 5 reasons for offering online learning were, had to do with something about the logistics or, increasing kids' access to courses that they wouldn't be able to take otherwise, either because they're not able to attend school, possibly for a medical reason, because of scheduling conflicts. This is going to be particularly important for rural schools where there's not as many options for when courses are scheduled. And actually, if you go down to the 6th reason, courses not available at the school. So you have this mix of wanting to provide kids with a new or different kind of learning environment, as well as addressing some logistical needs of getting kids access to courses that they wouldn't be able to take otherwise. One of the things I think that's interesting about this slide is if you look down throughout the list, you can see that, that among the schools that were using online learning, they weren't reporting, they weren't identifying things like needing teacher coverage or school space, but really focusing on these other topics. Okay. So we knew that schools were using online courses, but we knew from one of the things our members of the Research Alliance wanted to know was, even among the schools that are using online courses, what are the challenges that they're encountering in doing so? And here again, I'd like to focus first on the top few reasons. You can see that the top 3 reasons all have to do with concerns about students' educational experiences in online courses. Concern about the quality of online courses, concern about the academic integrity of online courses, and concern about the lack of face-to-face interaction that kids are going to have with students in online courses. I'd also like to point out that there was less of a concern about technology, funding, and bandwidth. Now, it's not surprising that they're using online courses that a lack of technology or bandwidth isn't going to be a challenge for them. But I do think it's interesting to point out that lack of funding was something that wasn't a problem for these schools that were deciding to use online courses. So as I mentioned earlier, of the 99 CASDA public high schools that received the survey, 59 of them responded, and a little more than half, 60% of the schools indicated that they were using online courses, that they had enrolled a student in an online course during the 2012-2013 school year. Our Research Alliance members also wanted to know why some schools were choosing not to enroll students in online courses. And so that's what this next slide covers. So what were the factors that influenced schools' decision not to use online courses? And what we all, so the Alliance members and the researchers, have found to be a quite interesting finding from this survey is that both the schools that use online courses as well as the schools that are not using online courses, both groups of schools, or all schools, identify concerns about students' educational experiences. So the schools that weren't using online courses in 2012-2013 indicated that their concern, again, about face-to-face interaction between teachers and students, concern about online course quality, and concern about academic integrity were some of the primary motivating factors for why they were choosing to not use online courses. In here, in addition, there's also challenges of funding and technology, access to technology. So one of the goals of the RELs is not just to collaborate with our Research Alliance members to identify research questions and to conduct studies, but to also talk about and encourage the use of data to inform educational decision-making. So one of the things that we did at the end of our study was to think about possible next steps that any school or district could undertake to look at their use of online courses. So given the prevalence of online course use for credit recovery and in this particular set of schools, we thought and think it would be valuable for states and districts to use their own data to think about, how are they going about implementing online learning opportunities to provide students with credit recovery opportunities, what kinds of supports are students getting, what kinds of access to technology do students have if they're using online for credit recovery. What are the academic outcomes that students who are taking online credit recovery courses, how are they able to finish the courses? Are they successfully completing the courses? What kinds of support students may be getting from folks in their own school? And one of the things we encourage people to think about in this report, and we're going to have the benefit of hearing from Fiona Hollins later on in this session, was to begin to think about, are the online credit recovery courses that they're using more or less cost-effective than than face-to-face credit recovery courses? So thinking about whether schools are getting the kind of educational return that they are hoping for based on their investment in providing kids with these opportunities. All right. So at this point, I don't know if there are any questions. For me, I don't think so based on what I'm seeing. Here I wasn't able to follow the chat while I was talking, but the findings are pretty straightforward. I, again, want to encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about this study or seeing the full survey that we used in the CASDA study, to access either one of these reports, the blue cover of the report, and it's available, I think, for download. I actually don't know. I'm just now realizing that the full study may not be available online, but you can certainly access it from the REL website that I think Peter's going to put in the chat. And then we do have the PDF of the stated briefly version of this study. Both are available for you to download.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy, for your presentation. And the study is in the download pod. It's called Study One, online courses in New York. Yeah, and yeah, we'll also put a link in the chat room. We did have a question. I think Fiona may have engaged that, but there is a question there in the chat on the lower left. Can you elaborate on, from Marty Park? That's great about the cost reduction was down the list a bit. Anything you want to comment on there?
I'm just going to have to, I just want to find this.
And we also pasted it over in the holding pen on the right, but...
Yep, I see, yeah. No, this is, that's so, I think I want to make sure, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of what you're pointing out is that the motivation to reduce costs didn't figure highly in schools' decision to use online courses. And you're right, I didn't go through the whole list of them, but you noticed that from the slide and make a good point. Yeah, no, you're right. Schools were not setting out to save money using online learning. And I think once you hear the results of the study that that Kirk Walters is going to present, you'll realize that there may not be a lot one can necessarily save in using online courses well. I think that's what a lot of people doing research on online learning might suggest. We certainly know from some of the other research that we've done, a study I worked with on Dr. Walters in the past and other research studies that I've read about using online courses for the courses. Actually, I want to make sure I'm saying this correctly. When online courses have been used effectively, their students enrolled in online courses have received support from a number of different places. So they've had access to an online teacher. They've had access to someone in the school who's trained to support their engagement and monitor their progress in online courses. So you're right. The idea of saving money didn't figure highly here, and I'm not sure it would ever be a great motivator for using online courses. Let's see.
Yeah, and there's another question there in the holding pen on the right, or on the lower right from Sarah.
Yeah, so Sarah, the study that's going to talk about credit recovery and more traditional credit recovery, that's really where we're going to, that's where Dr. Walter's study is going to really be very interesting, I think. Our study, our survey study, was really intended to just get a lay of the land in this part of the country about how schools were using online courses. So this may be a great opportunity for me to hand things over for our next presentation. So I'd first like to take the opportunity to introduce Kirk. Dr. Kirk Walters is a principal researcher at AIR, where his research focuses on understanding ways to improve K-12 mathematics teaching and learning. In addition to his work on the efficacy of online credit recovery study that he's going to be presenting about today, Dr. Walters is currently leading or contributing to an impressive portfolio of mathematics education research studies. Some of these include the Promoting Student Success in Algebra I study, and this study provides practitioners and policymakers with evidence on how to improve algebra achievement for struggling students, and the Math Professional Development Study, which is a large-scale experimental evaluation of an intensive content-focused PD program for fourth grade teachers. Teaching mathematics. Before Kirk started graduate school, he spent 9 years as an urban middle and high school math teacher in Los Angeles and the Washington, D.C. metro areas, serving as department chair, mentor teacher, and math professional development facilitator. I've heard Kirk and his colleague Jessica Hepin and others actually that are listed here present about this study, and I think it's very interesting. I'm very enthusiastic about it, and I'm glad that Kirk could be with us today. I'm handing it over to you, Kirk.
Thanks, Peggy. Happy to be here, and I'm also happy to be part of a large team that worked on this study, which we titled the Back on Track study, and we were looking at comparing online and face-to-face students in the context of Algebra I in the critical summer after 9th grade. And there's a long list of folks. Jessica Hepin, my colleague at AIR, is the PI for this project. Co-PI was Elaine Allensworth from the Chicago Consortium on School Research. I won't list all of those people, but even beyond those that are listed on this slide, there were lots of research assistants and folks that went out in the field over the summer to really pull this study off, and it was a great team, so I'm happy to represent them. In terms of why we wanted to do this study in the first place, again, this is looking at credit recovery after the freshman year for kids who had failed the second semester of Algebra I in particular. And we know that Algebra I is a common place where kids trip up in their high school course-taking progression, and having been an algebra teacher in the past, I can attest that it's definitely a challenge, especially in less advantaged neighborhoods and school districts. It's even more of a challenge to get that critical 9th grade algebra credit. We also know that online classes are expanding as a way to help those kids recover those credits. There's opportunities to take the courses over the summer, and during the school year we decided to focus on the summer offering. And yet there's just not a lot that's known about whether these courses actually work and help those kids get back on track, which is hence the name of our study. Again, in terms of how prevalent these courses are, and Peggy's presentation also indicated that credit recovery was one of the top uses for online courses, and it is fast growing across the country, particularly in urban districts, and our study was focused in Chicago. We also had a theory going into the study that students who fail a face-to-face course, perhaps part of the reason is that that mode was not best for them. So offering an online mode of delivery would be a different way to present the content, and perhaps seeing it differently the second time would be beneficial. Online courses have the potential to provide rich interactive graphics to make the content potentially more meaningful than at least my whiteboard skills were quite limited when I was a teacher. So in theory, the technology could really enhance particularly the concepts of math, in this case algebra. There's also more flexibility built into online courses in terms of how kids are progressing, the ability to provide individualized feedback and sort of a more customized approach, in also the immediacy of the feedback. Online courses are able to do that through the use of technology much more quickly than a teacher handing back a stack of quizzes even at the end of the class period. Finally, there's just flexibility in that if a school, it's one thing to set up a section of algebra for kids. It's quite another to say, hey, we have room in the computer lab, or even if you have a laptop, there's opportunities for kids to get access to that content without bringing another person in the building. So we felt like we had a pretty strong rationale for the study. The U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences funded this study. They are funding this webinar. This is a grant through the National Center of Education Research, and we had three primary goals. One, we wanted to see if the online versus the face-to-face summer course, whether they were different in a rigorous experimental way. So it was an efficacy study of those two modes of summer algebra. So we looked at a number of different academic outcomes, student outcomes. We also were interested in the implementation conditions of both types of courses. So we collected a lot of rich implementation data over the summer, and the results that I'll be presenting are combined results over two summers, summer of 2011 and summer of 2012. And then we were also interested, thirdly, to see whether and how early credit recovery could help these at-risk students get back on track. So it was intentional to intervene in the summer after ninth grade because under the theory that sooner is later, and kids that are further and further behind later in high school would have less and less of a chance of getting back on track quickly. So we also looked at longer term and are still looking at some longer term outcomes for kids. So today, just real quickly, there are going to be two pieces to this presentation, and they won't be long. The first part, and there'll be a chance for questions after each part. So the first part of the presentation, I'm just going to present the results on the efficacy study, where we compare the results from the face-to-face and the online classrooms. And then the second part, I'm going to describe a little bit more about what the content was like in both types of courses, which we think is important in understanding these results. So this was an experimental study. We used random assignment of students. It was a within-school lottery. So we recruited a number of schools to the study, and because we wanted the design to be as strong as possible, and if you have no shows in your experimental design, people that don't show up, it's problematic. So we decided to do the random assignment on site in these high schools, and so it went remarkably well. But we assigned kids by lottery to take an online or a face-to-face class. It was throughout Chicago. Our partner was Aventa Learning, also known, it was Aventa at the time, but K-12 Education. We didn't pick the course randomly. It was a course that Chicago had been implementing for a few years prior. They had also tested a few other online courses, and they thought this one was a good fit for them. So it was a nice partnership between a district, a provider that had been working with the district, and then research partners. And the comparison group was a typical face-to-face summer course in the way that schools in Chicago carried out those courses. So that's a brief overview of the study. In terms of the sample, again, it was on-site random assignment. About 90% of these kids were first-time freshmen, which was our goal. But as you might imagine, because the study provided the summer course for free, and everybody on the study team worked really hard to increase the access over the summer for these kids, and the grant provided money for that, for both the online and the face-to-face conditions. And in some cases, we had non-first-time freshmen who attended as well, but our primary target was first-time freshmen. So we had, as you can see, over the 2 summers, our pooled sample is about almost 1,400 kids, a little less than 700 in each condition. And as you can see, I'll let you read the table, but the class sizes were under 20, between 15 and 20 per class across both years of the study. You can see that the second cohort, the 2012 cohort, was bigger than the first cohort, almost 800 kids versus almost 600. In terms of who failed the course, just big takeaway here is that demographically, the students in our sample who had failed were not that different from those who passed. There were some small differences or some notable significant differences listed below, but nothing, majorly different. Students were obviously lower performing, which is why they were enrolled in summer credit recovery, so they had lower GPAs. They were much more likely to be off track than students who had been successful in 9th grade. And we also know among those students who failed during 9th grade that those who attempted the credit recovery, they were slightly more likely to be Latino and had a lower absence and suspension rates than those who didn't attempt. So those are some differences there. So in summer 11 and summer 12, you can see the number of sections, an equal number of online and face-to-face in both summers. The course was 3.5 to 4 weeks long in summer 12, in summer 2011, and in summer 12, the district actually had a standard 3-week offering, so it was even shorter. In 2011, we had no major technologies to speak of. There were some issues in summer of 2012, however, and I won't go into all those details right now, but there were some problems during especially the second session of summer 2012. There you have the content of the online course was entirely second semester algebra, and yet the face-to-face courses those were more of a mix of content, second semester, first semester, and pre-algebra determined by the face-to-face teachers, which is how it typically happens in Chicago. Our short-term outcomes were students' attitudes. We have grades, and of course we administered an of course algebra assessment, and then longer term we have the plan scores, which is administered throughout the district and CPS, math course taking, on-track status, and graduation. In terms of the student attitudes, again, this is looking at the pooled sample across both summers. You can see 3 ovals there. If they're not highlighted in oval, it means there was really no difference. There's no significant difference statistically between the online and the face-to-face kids. So student engagement, classroom personalization, and the usefulness of math measures on our survey, there were no differences between the 2 groups. If you see math confidence and liking, so the face-to-face students reported having a higher confidence and a higher liking of math than the online students. The online kids perceived the class to be more difficult, and it was second semester algebra rather than a mix of pre-algebra, Algebra I, and second semester algebra. The face-to-face students also perceive their course to have more clarity than the online students. And again, this is student self-report data.
Hey, Kirk, this is Peg.
Yes.
I know that you're trying to cover a lot, but I am such a huge fan of this study, so I'm going to take a second just to let I know you're going to try and hurry within the allotted amount of time, but I'm going to actually let you not do that because I really want our audience to have a chance to look at these findings because I think they're so important. The idea that the kids in the online course really reported there was a big difference between them and the face-to-face kids in terms of how difficult they perceived the class. And then sort of going in the opposite direction, the face-to-face kids reporting that they thought their class was much clearer, and they also, the face-to-face kids, ending up feeling a bit more confident and positive about mathematics. And one of the things I really like about this study so much is the care with which you all identified the outcomes, the attitudinal outcomes, which are really important in addition to the academic outcomes. So now I will let you proceed.
Okay. No, that's great. Feel free to interrupt whenever you feel like it. In part, I'm rushing because there's so much to talk about, and
Sure,
I also think it might help as we move along. There'll be time for questions, and just to let folks know that there will be more of a more detailed description about what those online and face-to-face courses were really about in the second part. So, but it's very important to note these differences and then to attach them to, once you have a better understanding of what the course was really about, it might even make more sense, although so noted. We also looked at students' credit recovery grades, and as you can see from this graph that, again, this is pooled across both summers, that the face-to-face students did have significantly higher grades and credit recovery rates compared to the online students. It's worth noting, though, that overall those rates were quite high. When you think about designing a study where you're trying to get kids that had not been successful during the 9th grade year, just to show up to take either course, and the fact that roughly 2/3 of them, and even higher in the face-to-face condition, did recover their credits. That in of itself is was an empirical question for us, and so that's just worth taking into account, that the majority of the kids did recover their credits. The grade distributions, we could spend a little bit more time on that. In fact, I think the next slide, well, you can see that the distribution of grades between the online and the face-to-face courses, that there are some differences there, which will probably make even more sense as we get into the nature of the content in both courses. You already know that the online course was perceived to be harder by the kids, and you also know that it did focus exclusively on second semester algebra, which is more difficult than first semester algebra or pre-algebra. The post-tests that we administered to students at the end of summer school, we did find that the face-to-face students scored significantly higher on this post-test. Just really quickly on that, we wanted a post-test measure that was not overly aligned to the online course. So we, for instance, we could have administered the Eventa second semester algebra test, but that would have been over-aligned to the online students. So what we tried to do was come up with the best public released NAEP items from the National Assessment of Education Progress that addressed second semester algebra, first semester algebra, and a little bit of pre-algebra, in part because we knew that these kids were entering second semester algebra with some deficiencies. If you look at the other outcomes there, so you have the overall post-test score. We broke out our post-test by pre-algebra, Algebra 1A first semester, and Algebra 1B, and we didn't see differences at the sub-score level, but there was an overall significant difference in favor of the face-to-face students. We also looked at the plan assessment overall in math, and there were no significant differences on the plan, which is a pre-ACT measure, between the two groups. We also followed these students into 10th grade, and as you can see, almost all of the students in our study, per district policy, were enrolled in geometry in the fall, 96 versus 97%. I guess the key takeaway there is there are no differences by treatment between the online and face-to-face students in terms of the geometry passing, either first semester or second semester, or their on-track status by the end of their second year of high school. no significant differences by condition. And I realize I went over my time a little bit here, but just in conclusion, and now there'll be a time for some brief discussion. In the short term, the face-to-face class, those students appeared to benefit more from that summer credit recovery opportunity compared to the online students. They had higher grades and passing rates. Their post-test scores were higher. Yet most students were successful, and when you look in either condition, and when you look into the 10th grade year, that there are just little differences in outcomes at that point. We know that the students in the online class perceived their class to be harder, and that students with higher ability found the face-to-face course easier, while kids of all ability levels found the online course to be similarly difficult. So that's also worth noting and might be fleshed out a little bit more when I talk about what was in both of the courses next.
So, Kirk, we've gotten some great questions from our audience members. One of the questions was from Sarah Frizzell. And I don't remember this about your study. Did you all ask students whether or not they had ever taken a previous online course?
That's a great question in the survey. I don't know if we asked that question directly. I'll try to get an answer even before the end of this webinar if we ask that question specifically.
Yeah, I mean that definitely, Sarah, your question I think represents something that a lot of us, or a lot of people in the online field do expect, although I don't think it's ever been demonstrated empirically, that having experience in an online course might improve kids' ability or might increase kids' likelihood of succeeding. The other three questions that we have, a new question from Linda, and then questions from Thomas Baylor and Robert Mazer. Kirk, I'm actually going to hold, and I hope this is okay with our participants, I'm going to hold those questions until after the next part of your presentation, because I think your responses to those questions will be influenced by what you have to say at that point. Yep, and just a comment from Jeff Renard. Thanks, Jeff. Previous experience with online learning, as well as whatever orientation was provided, Jeff will say would have a big impact on success, and as the skeptical researcher, I'm going to say could have a big impact on success, but I know that that's an important question and an important topic out there about making sure that kids are prepared for an online course. Thanks, Jeff. Kirk, you want to move on to the second part?
Sure. Okay, so the second question that we were interested in is thinking a little bit more about the nature and features of the online and the face-to-face courses that were part of this experiment. And so to do that, we had very fine-grained detail from the online course, which of course is you're able to archive pretty much everything that happens. The content is highly specified. It's easy to track progress at a fine-grained level. You pretty much you're able to see a lot in the online course, which makes sense. And we also cared a lot about what was going to happen in the face-to-face classes, and we knew going into the study that the business as usual condition, and having taught summer school myself in the past, one of the challenges in offering summer school is even having enough teachers that are willing to come in and give up their summer. And the way it usually works in Chicago is that once you've identified a summer school teacher, they do know that they're teaching, in this case, second semester Algebra 1B, but it's really up to them to create the syllabi, decide what's best for those kids, and proceed. And they have a lot of autonomy. So we knew it was critically important to capture the content of what was happening in those face-to-face courses, especially, as well as the nature and features and some of the other aspects, not just the topics, but also the nature of the content. So as I mentioned, we have rich archived online course data. the topics covered. We're able to describe the progression and performance of kids throughout the online course. Again, through the syllabi and the table of contents from the face-to-face materials, they literally gave us their syllabi, or if they didn't have a syllabus, the face-to-face teachers would create a table of contents from their textbook and annotate it, and that would allow us to get a sense of course progression and coverage. We also were interested not only in the topics that were covered, but we were trying to get a sense of rigor, and if the grading criteria that teachers in the face-to-face condition and the online mentors, if they applied similar criteria to assigning grades. Just as a point of clarification, that in the online class, kids' progress was automatically tracked, so they had a cumulative percentage based on quizzes and tests in the online course. But even with those data, the online mentor who monitored kids typically in a computer lab over the summer, it was up to the online mentor to assign the final grade. So they had the online course information to inform their grade, but it wasn't dictated entirely by how they did on the online course. Whereas the face-to-face teachers did not have access to an online course to incorporate into their grading criteria or system. So we collected that information too. And then also listed on there are the student post-test scores, because we were interested in breaking out the post-test by pre-algebra, Algebra 1A and 1B, and those are themes that come through in our analysis of the courses. So, as expected and as advertised, the online course emphasized second semester algebra 100% of the time. There were not opportunities in this particular course for kids to go back and address topics or concepts or skills that may have been introduced earlier in algebra. There are other courses that are designed to do that. This one was not. When you look at the face-to-face classes, and after analyzing all of the syllabi and tables of contents, it was not entirely Algebra 1B. It was roughly 60% 1B, and the other 40% roughly was a mix of Algebra 1A, first semester algebra, and pre-algebra content. And it's also worth noting that there was just a lot of variability across the face-to-face classes. So in some cases, you would have students in classes where 100% of the lessons from their textbook that their face-to-face teacher was using was all 1B or second semester algebra. In some cases, it was 0% 1B, which is worth noting. And perhaps understandable given where these kids were, that many of them didn't, they weren't successful in second semester algebra, and it's not surprising that deficits in 1A or pre-algebra were part of that story. In terms of the sequencing of the topics, that you can think of the online course as kind of like an online textbook, in that you had units which function like chapters, and then lessons nested within those units or chapters, and it was pretty traditional in terms of sequencing. If you looked at the way those topics are rolled out in the online course, you could pick up a textbook, sort of a traditional algebra textbook, and probably see some similarities there. Whereas in the face-to-face course, again, there was a lot of variability here. It ranged from things where it was more textbook driven, not necessarily as sequential as the online course, but more similar to that, versus in some cases the teachers generated everything, all of the curriculum materials from free resources off the web or different materials that they had accumulated over time, supplemental worksheets, and so forth. When we looked at the sequencing of the face-to-face courses, we determined that more than a quarter were really out of sequence. We couldn't really see a logical pattern to how they were put together in the face-to-face courses. In terms of the knowledge emphasis, so when you think of math as being a set of skills versus concepts versus problem solving and application, if you think of those three buckets. The online course was more procedural than conceptual in that there were more lessons where that was the focus, more skill-based, although there were some conceptual and application opportunities for kids in the online course. When you look at the face-to-face materials that we were able to review, it was almost entirely procedural. So probably how many of you experienced algebra, which were lots of practice problems and worksheet type things where you're solving a bunch of equations on one page or simplifying expressions, and that was pretty much how the face-to-face courses looked, although we didn't have as much detail for all of the face-to-face classes as we did for the online courses. So in some cases it was high-level detail because they gave us everything they handed out to kids. In other cases it was an annotated textbook, and we had to look at the available problems in the textbook that they could have used to base this assessment. So in conclusion, when you think about the nature, the features, the content of both the online and the face-to-face classes, we know that the online students thought that the class was, they perceived it to be harder than the face-to-face students. And they did a little worse. And when you look at the content, a fair question is, maybe the second semester course was just too difficult. It's one possibility. We did think about whether to offer first semester algebra as a summer credit recovery. We kind of went back and forth a little bit on that, but more kids in Chicago failed the second semester, and it was, I guess, a little more policy relevant to focus on that larger group of kids over the summer that really needed that second semester credit. But it is fair to say, well, that second semester is harder, and just providing second semester algebra is perhaps too hard for kids that are really behind. We know that the face-to-face students experienced a program over the summer that was probably aligned a little more closely to where they were in terms of prior knowledge and skills. And yet, it seems too simplistic to say that the solution is just to dumb down your face-to-face summer courses and to do all basic skills and pre-algebra and Algebra I. There has to be some kind of balance between remediation and rigor, and I think we need to learn more about what that balance is. And so in moving forward, thinking about what is, really the core, what's core Algebra 1A and 1B, and figuring out what those proficiency and levels and skill levels really look like is something that I don't think we've quite figured out yet, and we need to keep working on. And this is one, again, one study that hopefully can contribute to some of those to answering some of those questions and pushing the field into, learning more about this important issue. And I think there are others that will probably, even on this webinar, have some ideas related to this. So I think there should be another slide with our contact information, which you'll all have through this webinar, and things you want to read. Appreciate your attention, or at least you seem to be attentive. I didn't hear anybody interrupt.
Thanks so much, Kirk. So we have a few questions. I'm actually going to start just building on some of your last comments and your conclusions, some of the questions that you all have at the end of the study. A question from Jeff Renard is, do you think there could have been a scope sequence mismatch from the local course versus the online course? You touched a little bit on that, but do you want to add anything? Could there have been a scope sequence mismatch from the local course versus the online course?
I'm not quite sure what so the mismatch between, is that in terms of how it aligns with the outcome measures? I mean, there clearly was a the face-to-face courses were
Quite
unless the question is getting at like what is Chicago's vision of what should be second semester algebra.
But my memory is that that they actually chose the event, of course, because they thought it was a good match. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, I think that the content of the second semester course captured in Eventa is more aligned to the scope and sequence of second semester algebra in Chicago. For sure, that's true. And yet, we also know that business as usual, in probably not just in Chicago, but in many places, potentially over the summer, is that the summer school teacher has a lot of discretion in putting this syllabi together. So I think I think I might have, hope I answered that question. It's a good question.
You did, and and that's one of the things I think is so interesting about this study is how different kids' educational experiences were. Can
I just really quickly say that on the student survey, piggybacking on the earlier question that was asked about whether we asked kids if they had prior experience with taking an online course, we did ask them how many courses they had in any subject, not algebra, that were either totally online, a mix of online and face-to-face, or a computer-based course that gave them extra instruction, like to supplement another class. So there were some survey questions that got at that.
Okay, all right. But I don't think you guys have analyzed those. Is that right?
Yeah, or if we have, I don't think we found anything that was that interesting. But I can follow up on that afterwards.
Okay. So a couple of other, you did such a nice job of talking about the topics covered and the sequencing of the topics covered and the knowledge emphasis. Did you all look at, I want to get at a couple of the questions, did you all look at the kinds of the number or amount of opportunities that kids had to communicate with an online course? So I'm thinking in particular of Linda's question. Was the online course a blended model? Did teachers communicate via email, discussion board, phone, or personal visits?
Yes. So it was a blended model in that so there was an online teacher and there was a mentor, and I probably should have explained this more in the setup, but a typical setup was that you had a mentor in a class of 20 or so kids in the computer lab. Each of those kids had an online teacher. The online teacher would set up, in some cases, like little webinars. There were opportunities for interactions with the online teachers and the students. We did not find that kids took advantage of a lot of those. There was some interaction between the online teacher and the online mentor, the mentor who was in the class, but most of that was about grades and more administrative kinds of things. So I'd say in terms of what was available to make it a vibrant, active online community, we didn't see a lot of uptake on that.
Okay, and I think that actually that also addresses a question that Thomas Baylor had. So thanks very much for that. Let's see. I want to just figure out the next question. There's a lot of questions. So when Robert Mazur raises a question, I think he's asking you to speculate a little bit about the findings. Kirk, you pointed out the differences in student attitudes between the face-to-face and the online kids early in your presentation, and Robert asks, would you anticipate a change in student perceptions if the online course was more similar to the face-to-face course content, specifically if the online course had embedded elements of pre-algebra? Do you want me to say that again?
Yeah, no, I got it. I think that's a really good question. Speculating, I would say that there probably would have been more engagement. I probably should have mentioned, too, that the online students did not complete the entire second semester course because we're able to measure progression. They finished roughly 60% of it, 3/5, 3 of the 5 units. And realizing that I mean, I was an algebra teacher. I never finished the whole book. So I'm not sure that we have a standard for like what is enough, how many chapters or units is enough to be considered like, the whole thing. But I think it's possible that if there were opportunities for students to revisit some of the prior, and it could have been pre-algebra or it could have been Algebra I topics, that you may have seen, I suspect, a different perception in terms of how hard it was, but I don't know. But I'd guess yes.
Thanks, Kirk. So I just want to point out a comment from Sarah and give you a chance to confirm this, I think. Sarah writes, it sounds like one thing that could be happening is that teachers in a face-to-face class may adapt to where the students are at, and so she says that. It sounds like one thing that could be happening is that teachers in a face-to-face class may adapt to where students are at. And then she asks, were online students allowed to test out of certain sections to meet them where they were at? Or were there, and it's sort of, I guess, in general words, there any kind of formative or testing about where kids' needs were?
Right. Yes. So you could, if you not ace the test, but if you scored 70% or higher on a unit test or a quiz within a lesson, so the answer is yes. In the online course, you could advance, but we didn't see we saw some of that, but not a whole lot of it. There were a few kids that actually finished early before the summer school was over. They got to go home in a couple cases where schools allowed it. What was more common, and which probably makes more sense in this case, given where the kids were in terms of their prior achievement and skills, is that it did appear that there were a lot more of the face-to-face teachers who were trying to meet kids with, all right, order of operations, let's solve one-step equations. We can't do systems of equations, which is a second semester topic, until you can solve a one-step equation. So I think the opportunities the online kids had for personalization or to make sure they weren't stuck on something they were bored with, given that it was second semester algebra, there just weren't as many of those, even though theoretically they could have moved ahead.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks very much. Let's see. Como Molina asks, was the post-test parallel to the course content in terms of procedural types of questions versus conceptual types of problem-solving types? You pointed out the differences in the knowledge emphasized in the two kinds of in the two conditions,
yeah,
I was asking.
That's a good question. Because we decided to use public release NAEP items for lots of reasons, just so we could kind of see how our kids did compared to the national average. And by the way, overall students in both conditions didn't do very well on these NAEP items, under 40% correct. And again, this is a test that had a fair number of pre-algebra and Algebra 1A items on it. So that's important just to keep in mind. In terms of the alignment question, I would say that it was a pretty good match. Since the online course, we know that the face-to-face course was highly procedural, at least for the materials that we had to analyze. We know that the online course was more procedural than conceptual in application. And the same was really true of our post-test. And if you've looked at NAEP items from maybe not the newest NAEP items, but the ones that we drew from when we did the study and created the assessment back in 2011, were more procedural than conceptual. So I'd say roughly yes, long-winded way.
Great, thanks. We're running out of time for questions, so I'm going to actually, Marnie Bromberg asked the question, which I think will also just give you a chance to review again what the math outcomes were for the study. So Marnie Bromberg asks, were either of the types of recovery courses, face-to-face or online, particularly effective at boosting algebra learning, right? So this is the assessment you were just talking about, because not just grades or recovered credit, but achievement. And I don't know if you want to run back quickly to that slide, or if you just want to verbally review what the results were for your different academic outcomes.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that they didn't do great on any of the measures that we either developed for the study or looked at in the longer term, the plan scores, for instance. So, I mean, it looks like there was some learning, but there wasn't anything so surprising where you're like, wow, it looks like they, for instance, learned a ton of first semester algebra on our post-test or second semester algebra. So given those overall rates, I'd say probably not.
Yeah, okay. So at this point, Kirk, I may point you to a couple of questions that we didn't get to answer from some of our colleagues, excuse me, but at this point I want to turn to our colleague Fiona Hollins, who's going to comment on the work and on the field of online learning generally. I just want to say, going into this, I'm really delighted to have both of the presenters. I think their work is just so strong, and I'm really delighted that Dr. Fiona Hollins is joining us today to comment on the research we've talked about today. I think her work and her thinking is very compelling. Dr. Hollins is the Associate Director at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies of Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research applies cost-effectiveness analysis methods to educational programs with the aim of demonstrating how policymakers can optimize the use of resources in education. Her recent studies have addressed high school completion, early literacy, and online learning, including MOOCs. And I actually want to draw your attention to actually I don't know if it's here, but I want to make sure, I want to point y'all's attention, oh yes, look in the chat box, your attention to Fiona's MOOC study, so you can go and look for it if you'd like to. I highly recommend it. Dr. Hollins is part of a team that's developing an online tool to facilitate cost and cost-effectiveness analysis by other researchers and education decision makers. The goal of the tool is going to be to promote greater attention to uses of productivity in education. And Fiona, I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, Peggy, I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Great. All right, thanks for the introduction. And thank you both for your presentations. I was really thrilled to see both these studies out and about there, because really there has been very little research done on credit recovery, and I find this somewhat of a mystery. I'm hoping that some of the audience has some answers as to why this is the case. But you may have seen, and I just posted this in the chat a couple of minutes ago, that this month, the What Works Clearinghouse at the Institute of Education Sciences published a very, very brief intervention report on credit recovery programs, which basically says there are no studies on the effectiveness of credit recovery programs that meet their standards. Now, I am hoping that Kirk's study will be an exception to that, and that it will make its way into the What Works Clearinghouse a website as a model study there. But it's curious that credit recovery has been around for quite some time, and very few people are doing research in this area. So thank you to both Peggy and Kirk to making a change on that. One of the reasons why this might be the case is that, as the director of our center, who's an economist, Henry Levin, he believes that there are just no incentives for anyone to question the effectiveness of credit recovery. The real pressures on schools and districts at the moment are to increase graduation rates. So if you can increase your graduation rate, people aren't necessarily asking too many questions about how that's happening or whether the students are really learning. This is the case not just in K-12, but also in higher education at the moment. Everyone is looking at the credential. Do you have your degree? Do you have your high school diploma? Not asking what have you learned and what can you actually do as a graduate. But I do hope that some of you who are still listening out there might have some ideas about why you think there isn't much being done on the question of credit recovery, and perhaps what we can do about that. So just in terms of what I got out of this, or I think we can all get out of each of these studies, first on Peggy's survey, clearly it was a good perspective on how online learning is actually being used, and I don't think it was too much of a surprise, but I think it was good to have some hard numbers there on how much credit recovery is being used, and that is indeed the most prevalent goal for offering online courses. A couple of things that surprised me from that survey was how often they're being used for history and social studies, which I generally see as classes in which there'd be a good amount of discussion and debate, which obviously can happen online, but may not be as easy. So I was surprised about that. And as I guess Marty Park, one of the audience members, was also surprised, cost reductions were not a major consideration for most people. I thought that might be more of an issue driving people towards online credit recovery. Questions that we still need to ask, and I think Peggy would be the first to say that we do need to do more work in this area, is how are these trends that you found in the two studies that you mentioned that you've done, how do they play out across rural, urban, or suburban parts of the state? And obviously you've done work in a couple of different places, but we'd like to know how that looks across the entire country and why there might be differences in different places. Also, what are the participation rates for different subgroups? Are we seeing online courses and credit recovery in particular being used for any particular subgroup of learners, whether it's high or low SES, different ethnic groups, English learners, or special education students? And clearly we'd like to know eventually whether they are more or less effective for different subgroups. Given our interest here, we are particularly keen to find out more about what the resource requirements are and the cost for online credit recovery, and how does that compare to face-to-face credit recovery, or what would be the alternative, I guess, which is repeating the entire semester or the entire year for some students. There is another alternative that isn't on here, and I was discussing this earlier with Peggy and Kirk. What happens to the kids who don't show up for credit recovery? And it seemed that certainly in the study that Kirk did, they got some information from the district indicating that only about a third of the students who are eligible for credit recovery even show up to summer courses. So the other 2/3 are dropping out, or hopefully some of them coming back the following year. But clearly there's a significant issue going on there. On Kirk's study that we heard quite a lot about, I think that this is probably the first rigorous study that's been done that compares credit recovery courses face-to-face versus online. Certainly very well done study, and we'd like to see more of this going on. I'm not sure how surprising the results are. I think that a lot of people had some suspicions that credit recovery online might not be as rigorous. So I think maybe part of the surprise is that the students found the course to be harder online. But it was quite clear that the students that were taking the face-to-face courses were scoring higher grades. And it was kind of mixed on the tests. It seems like in 1 year there was a difference in the test scores, with the grades higher for face-to-face and the scores for the post-test higher in year 2, but in year 1 the post-test scores were the same for the two conditions. I'm curious about what's going on there with this difference in the grades and the test scores. So there's seems like, as a couple of the audience members have suggested, that maybe there's some misalignment on something. Either the teachers are not using a similar grading scheme, or the tests are not particularly well aligned to the what's being taught in the courses. So that's something to look out for in future studies, I think, to try and get a better comparison on that. The other thing that surprised me is that with the online courses, a lot of the talk about why we should be using them is because they allow us to personalize the experience for students. And it seemed that in this case, the students didn't feel that the courses online were more personalized. So I think there are some things that we still need to know about credit recovery, and again, hoping that there are some researchers out there who are interested in pursuing studies in this area. We certainly would like to know how much students in credit recovery courses, whether it's online or face-to-face, learn compared to similar students in regular courses. That's kind of a key issue, and one of the things that I don't know if the people who read the study may have noticed and was a little alarming in some ways, was that students in the online course spent around 26 hours on the course compared with 60 hours for summer school. And Kirk, you might want to comment as to whether the students who took the face-to-face course actually did spend the 60-hour seat time requirement, or whether they spent some significant amount of time less than that. But you're talking about less than half the time in the online course, so that's pretty dramatic. Certainly, again, to look at different subgroups of students, how does the performance compare for different students? And sort of maybe this question about the amount of time spent might give a hint here, but it would be interesting to know whether the students in online credit recovery programs earn their high school diplomas at a different speed from those in face-to-face credit recovery programs. If they can complete a course in less than half the time, can they actually complete their diploma in less, not necessarily than half the time, but less time? And that might be a consideration, even if they don't necessarily do significantly better. If they're doing about the same, but they can get it done much faster, that's a consideration for opportunity cost of their time. They could be out earning money during the summer if they're not spending time in their credit recovery programs. And also that might save teacher time too, if the teachers are only required to be supervising for half the amount of time. So the question of cost and effect should come together in the question of cost effectiveness. You have to look at both. A lot of people consider cost effectiveness as being sort of cost efficiency. Are we actually spending less on this? But it's not just a question of are we spending less, but are we making a good investment of resources here in terms of the return that you're getting out of it. So you could actually be spending more on one intervention, but getting a really substantially better result, and that could be considered to be cost effective. So you kind of have to start with what your considerations are. You're looking for more effectiveness, or you're looking for lower costs? Do you not care so much about the costs? And the cost effectiveness ratio that comes out of a cost effectiveness analysis isn't necessarily the only thing that's going to affect your decision about whether to go with one intervention or another, but it's something that you can use to help you decide which intervention to go with. So I certainly think that we need to collect more cost information on the different possibilities here, and I think, Kirk, we had talked about this earlier, and you may have a chance to comment a little bit on what you found in terms of the costs of the online versus the face-to-face program. And I had seen this in a question that an audience member posted earlier, that the long-term question here is, how do students who earn a high school diploma with one or more recovered credits fare down the line in college or when they're actually in a career, compared with students who graduate with no recovered credits? This is going to be a key issue longer term. And again, Kirk, I don't know, given that the study was done a little while ago, the paper that you wrote didn't have the sort of final outcomes. I don't know if you're able to say anything more about that in terms of the longer term outcomes, and in particular on the graduation rate for the students in the study. So I'll leave you with a few questions there if we have time to answer them.
Great. Do you want me to jump in, Peggy, or is this?
That'd be great, yes.
So just really quickly, there were lots of excellent questions from throughout the presentation and just here. Really quickly on the grading criteria, which I think is a very valid point. We did look, there did appear to be a difference between the online and the face-to-face teachers' grading criteria in the first summer, where it looked like in that first summer that the online mentors, so the teachers who ran the lab, incorporated quizzes and tests at a much higher rate than the face-to-face teachers into their grading criteria. So the online classes in that first summer were like 80% tests and quiz-based, 20% effort participation, and it was much lower in the face-to-face, where it was more more based on effort and attendance rather than how you did on a test or a quiz. It shifted a little bit in the second summer, so overall they were probably fairly comparable in terms of grading criteria, but the online course also could have been a little more difficult to get a higher grade because of how the tests and quizzes were used to calculate students' grades. So I think that's part of the story. There was another question about seat time, and
Kirk,
I think
I'm
that's
going to stop you for 1 sec.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go ahead.
I want you to finish this. So I just before, as people start to log off, I really apologize for interrupting. I want to point out the survey. We would really love to hear from people before, at the end of the session or as they're signing off, if they would please click on the Survey Monkey and complete a stakeholder feedback survey about the event. It's really important to us. It's important to the Department of Education to hear your impressions and feedback on the session. So we really ask you to please do that, and we'll finish out though with some great discussion and questions and answers from Kirk and Fiona. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, that's great. Presumably it's an online survey, which would be appropriate for this webinar.
Yes, it is an online survey,
Okay.
That's right.
You didn't mail them one, FedEx it back. I think the seat time point is an excellent one too. That the online students did not spend, at least what was recorded and captured in the Aventis system, was much less than the 60 hours that those students were basically in the lab over the summer, or close to that 60 hours. And I think that is something to pay attention to. Whereas the face-to-face students were, not that every minute of every face-to-face class was necessarily engaged in deep math learning. We didn't observe them every day, for instance. We did some classroom observations, but not to the extent where we would really know whether kids were doing on-task math learning for all of those 6 hours each day in the face-to-face classes. But I think it's a really good point that we thought that the online students would have spent more time logged into the course than what appeared. And the other question was related to, so we're not quite done with all of our students have not yet graduated or eligible for graduation, but we're getting close. I think we should have another paper out hopefully soon that has some of those longer term outcomes. But I think in general, we haven't seen anything that's too terribly surprising or different than like the immediate trends in 10th grade with both cohorts. So maybe stay tuned on that one, but it's certainly important to tell the full story.
I just wanted to bring especially Fiona's attention to a comment from Sarah Frizzell, a question from the rural perspective. For some frontier and reservation districts that she works with, the commute to school for teachers and kids can be really long, and that this would be an important cost to pay attention to. I'm pretty sure there haven't been any studies that have looked at anything like this, but I hadn't thought of that as an important cost to take into consideration, the ones outside of just what the school would be providing, or et cetera. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question. I wanted to go back to a question that Catherine had posed earlier, and it gets to this issue of kids' experience or orientation to online learning. Kirk, Catherine Kennedy had asked, did kids have the opportunity to complete some sort of orientation to online learning experience before starting the course?
They did. They had essentially a lesson. I think it was about an hour, maybe a little less than that, where it was an orientation to the Aventa course, how to navigate, what the different types of lessons and activities within lessons look like, how to take a quiz. So there was an introductory lesson that they did at the very beginning, but not beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a field we really want need some work, because I know it's something that's important to the online learning field. Fiona, I think you're back. I wanted to give you a chance to address this issue of that Sarah brought up about.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully it works this time. I don't cut us off.
Yep.
It is a great question, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we would be looking for, and we would count that. Certainly if they're older students, we might be looking at the opportunity cost of their time, and for the teachers as well, it clearly is a cost of implementation, so to speak. So if they're not having to travel in the summer to go to school, if it were during the school year and they're traveling to school anyway, we wouldn't necessarily consider the extra time they stay after school. We would just take the extra time, but not consider there's any extra travel necessarily. But certainly during the summer, that's a consideration. And you're right, Peggy, that I am not aware of any study that has been done, or certainly nothing that's been made public on this topic. I'm certainly very interested in looking at those things. So if there are people who want to investigate the costs of the credit recovery programs, I'm happy to talk to them about it.
Great.
Super quickly on urban travel, we did buy a lot of bus tickets for both the face-to-face and the online kids to get to summer school, and that was a cost, which worth noting. So, and I think this discussion and this discussant in particular has made me want to be really careful at looking at all of, I mean, we have all the data on costs, but I think it's really important to break that out, including everything from a bus pass to time, which is also fascinating.
So we are at the end of our allotted time. I always like to end these things on time out of respect to our wonderful presenters and our great audience today. One more time, I want to encourage everyone who is still with us to please complete the stakeholder feedback survey. You can see the link in the chat and also below the slides. I want to extend just an enormous thanks to Kirk for presenting the study, and to Fiona for all of her great questions. I also want to point to refer people to go to the RELNE website to see about the other work that we're doing, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Peggy, and this concludes today's Bridge Event webinar. You can cancel, quit out of your Adobe Connect platform and hang up the telephone, and in about a week to 10 days you'll receive a thank you email from us with today's slides and a recording of the webinar. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.